Mariam Kintsurashvili is a strategic communications expert countering hybrid warfare. This is the second interview we're having on the channel. I'm absolutely delighted to reintroduce her to the audience. What's happening in Georgia now is, I think, of paramount importance, not just to Georgians, but to Europe and indeed to the health and strength of democratic values around the world. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please, I know you're going to love this episode and the detail within it. Make sure you give it a like and check you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on any fantastic speakers and content in future. Thank you also to everyone who has become a patron or bought me a coffee. It is incredibly important to help keep the work of the channel going. Thank you to those as well who have supported the documentary film that we are working on. Your support and generosity, and of course, many of the messages I've received from you are tremendously important to help bring that project to reality. Mariam, welcome back to the channel, and I think it's important that we get an update on what is going on in Georgia.
Thank you, Jonathan. First of all, I would like to tell you how much I appreciate you giving platform to the Georgian voices and for your understanding of the processes, and how much I appreciate your audience's interest in our struggle. So the update, we are in the 11th day of the protests. Um, every day, the cruelty of the police and the regime, it's hard to call them police now, they're more of a Russian militia, is getting more and more outrageous. Uh, Many activists and journalists, very young people are targeted, they are beaten, they are brutally tortured by the spetsnaz, by this masked, unfaced criminal groups. It's hard to call them the law enforcement officers. They are targeting the media, journalists, because the regime knows that like media and the journalists they represent the biggest danger to them, as they show the world their crimes and atrocities they commit. Despite the cruelty and despite the unprecedented violence, the protest doesn't disperse, the protest wave doesn't go down. We see that the government, the so-called illegitimate government, is now trying to suppress us even more. First, they started with banning selling the fireworks, because fireworks was our peaceful method to resist the cruelty. So they made sure that fireworks were taken out from the selling points. Then the gas masks and helmets, which is vitally important for us to have as protesters for the safety, they were taken out of the shops and pharmacies. And now they stated that they are planning to ban all kinds of face coverings in the streets during the protests. And just today, the so-called prime minister, he declared that the parliament is now in the process of working on the bill of banning fireworks during the protests. So they are using good old Russian intimidation tactics. They are chasing people. Their titushki are out in the streets completely uncontrolled. They are attacking people. They are attacking activists, protesters, political activists. They beat severely the journalist of an opposition channel and her cameraman. Both of them now are in hospital. And the worst thing that this happened during the protests, and the patrol police, like two cars of patrol police, were standing next to them, 15 meters from there, and they didn't react. So now we have a new, very unfortunate slogan in our city, in our country, which is police everywhere, justice nowhere.
And of course, these techniques are horrific, and it's very difficult to talk about it because these are real people. Some of these people will be known to you and your colleagues as well. That makes it incredibly tough to contemplate it, and of course, the bravery. But the police have gone, I would say, full Lukashenko, full Belarus, and some of the tactics are horrifically cruel. They especially target people's faces and eyes, I've read, to damage their vision and to essentially put them out of action to ensure they can't continue their protests.
Yes, this is true. They are targeting people's faces. Doctors and lawyers report multiple fractures of the face bones, damage to eyes, damage to spine, a lot of brain damage and hematomas. They do it on purpose. It's another intimidation tactic. And when they do it, like they've learned, if we witnessed in the first days of protests, the masked spetsnaz, which I don't even want to call them riot police. They were targeting people in the streets, grabbing protesters and beating them in front of the cameras. And it was a public outcry. And it caused more and more people to come out. What they do now, they take people behind this wall of riot police and they walk them through this corridor of shame, as they call it, where they mercilessly beat people with they kick them in their faces, they spit on them, they torture them, they threaten them with horrible abuse, sometimes sexual abuse, like saying like if you are European, then you're gay, so they will like it, and horrible insults like that. And then they throw them in black minivans where they continue the torture. And like what beaten protesters and witnesses report, sometimes in the isolation facilities, like in jails, the torture continues. This is very hard to talk about because like these people, the protesters are not criminals. They are the best representatives of our nation. They are young, free people who were born in a free country and who don't want Russia and everything that is close to Russia. And Bidzina Ivanishvili and his gang, they are just dragging us there. So we have no other choice but resist, no other choice to fight. That's why we see that more and more people come out and more people try to defect from this government. We've seen 6 ambassadors from different countries who resigned as a sign of a protest, and we see a lot of open letters by different public institutions, the municipalities, the ministries, where they sign those letters, where they express their distrust towards the new government policies and their condemnation of the change in our foreign policy, as well as condemnation of treatment of protesters and prisoners.
And I can see some of the comments are going to be if I label some of these tactics and the psychology behind them as being an export from Russia, people might say, well, hang on a second, that's, surely, these are Georgian police inflicting the violence. How can you say this is Russian? The kind of techniques you've described there, I mean, I saw some of these being used by OMON back in the 1990s. This has always been the way that Russian paramilitary police have behaved. And indeed, I suspect that these methods have been exported around the world, including to Georgia and to the infamous Berkut, which was disbanded in Ukraine after the success of Maidan. So do you see this, even though the individuals committing these crimes are doing it on the orders of Georgian politicians and themselves are ethnic Georgians, the methodology and indeed the sense of impunity is because they know they have Russian resources and Putin at their back?
Absolutely, absolutely. Couldn't have said better. The sense of impunity and lawlessness in the country is huge. And this is all due to the state capture that we've talked about in our previous interview with you, Jonathan. But it's very important to understand how the state capture happened and why those Georgians act like Omon and like Berkut. It doesn't state capture doesn't happen in a day. And in case of Georgia, it was true special operation led by Moscow, by Kremlin, which lasted for 12 years. And now we see the results and the culmination of this special operation. So post 2008 war, Russia decided to change their tactics from the hot war to hybrid warfare, and Georgia was probably the first testing ground for it. So they created their candidate, Oligarch Ivanishvili, who is basically, he was a billionaire, a shareholder in Gazprom, and as they say in Russia, the treasurer, the holder of Obshag, so the pool of this dirty money that belongs to the organized crime group called Russian government. And he was sent basically to Georgia with one and only mission to bring us back to the orbit of Russia. However, knowing the Georgian people and knowing the pain of Georgians and their resentment towards Russia having 20% of our territory occupied by Russians, it would not be easy to do it in a day or two. It took decades. At the same time, they were lying to the West and using Western support to beef up their resources, because what we see now is that riot police, all the law enforcement officers, they were trained by our Western partners and using Western money. All those water cannons were bought with the Western support. Their uniforms, their ratios, everything like was used from the donor money that was intended to reform and professionalize our law enforcement system. Same to all other institutions in Georgia. We got huge amounts of support for in the cultural, in the educational, in the economic sphere on our path to the Euro-Atlantic integration, and with the EU association agreement and subsequent EU negotiations. So we were getting all that support, and Georgian Dream was using it for their own advantage and not for the advantage of people. Also, like the public broadcaster is a very good example. Georgian public broadcaster is one of the main channels for governmental propaganda. They are paid from our taxes, and they used to be supported by Western donors. They didn't platform any opposition leader, any social activist. They were refusing to platform president. Only after a huge protest and demands from the civil society, they gave 1 hour on air to the opposition voices and a 1 hour interview with the president. We can see the same in the public defender's office that was extremely efficient when it was led by a social activist, and now with the new leader, the new public defender, we see that all the governmental programs that were aimed at expanding the human rights agenda in Georgia are now just becoming like another.
Europe, US, and other places seem to be very, very slow to react, to place sanctions on Georgian Dream, indeed, to unambiguously condemn what is taking place. I mean, I'm just one person sitting in a room in Oxford talking to Georgians on a weekly basis, and I think forming a fairly clear idea of what's going on, the extreme brutality and the lack of, rule of law and so on. So the solution seems to me extremely obvious. But is part of the problem that international institutions and Europe have sunk so much money into Georgia, they are reluctant to face reality. So you have this sort of administrative and political inertia about taking any action. It's a little bit like the sort of German approach of, not sending tourists to Ukraine because, at some point we will have to negotiate with Russia. It's an assumption that isn't necessarily true, but it prevents action in the present.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Uh, Georgian Dream was very good at lying to our international partners, and our international partners were very good at turning the blind eye on whatever was happening in Georgia because activists and civil society, journalists, opposition, we were screaming about it on every possible platform for years now. Uh, However, we need what we need now is decisive actions, and we don't see it. Like the only countries who we see it from is unsurprisingly Ukraine, and Baltic states. We need clarity. Uh, there is no point in having the expressions of concern and condemnation because it's too late for us. We need to feel your back. If we don't, I don't know what we will end up with. As Zelenskyy rightly said, that we need principled position from the West. Because if we don't get it, we will be thrown into the abyss of this lawlessness and impunity for decades to come. And I don't know in which form Georgia will emerge from that.
And before we hit record, we were talking about what we are starting to find out about people who are not just in the sort of police and Siloviki, but also those who form the more thuggish element, more anonymous element, which is the titushki, which is the bands that go around abducting and beating people, and even sometimes waiting by their homes or places of work to catch them and intimidate them. But a list was leaked of the names of people who form some of these irregular kind of battalions, the thuggish wing of the government. And there's an interesting connection. Many of them seem to have connection with a particular flavor of Orthodox religion, which is heavily influenced by Russian world narratives. Is this an area which we need to learn a lot more about and be a lot more conscious of the sort of not just the basic propaganda brainwashing, but the more deep cultural and mythologized historical brainwashing that Russia actually seems to be rather good at?
I'm so glad you raised this point, Jonathan, because many people don't realize this. As I said, like about the state capture, about the current events that are unfolding, they don't happen in a day. Uh, so Russia through Bedzina and his gang, they have been brainwashing the Georgian people, certainly with the support of the Georgian Orthodox Church that has historically serious ties with not only Russian Synod, but Russian KGB. What we've witnessed is many people on this list, and the list that we are talking about is 147 of not just Titushki, but police officers, Spetsnaz, who just had their faces covered, that was leaked from the Ministry of Interior. And this is huge. It means that the Ministry of Interior is also like the fortress is being starting to be broken from the inside. And when the journalists and the activists started like exploring who these people were, almost 90% of them had some kind of religious posts or posts about traditional and family values, opposing them to all the European values. Also, according to some anonymous sources, the police officers, even patrol police officers, They are checked, their social media, especially their phones, they are checked for which accounts they are following, and they make sure that they don't follow opposition accounts. They are also they have psychological training units. I think some sorts of politruk who also brainwash them into believing all that conspiracy theories and propaganda that Georgian Dream is spreading. We've seen the footage of protesters trying to talk to Spetsnaz, like to those masked people, and trying to explain why people are standing there and what they are protesting against. And the responses we get are really, really scary because these people believe that they are fighting against Russia, that all those protesters are actually serving Russian interests, and they are the real patriots who protect Georgian identity and protect Georgian traditional values. A lot, like the two most important messages that they convey is one is that they don't want, like, very homophobic messages, that they don't want their children to become transgender or gay, and that this is the only thing that Europe brings. So this is very important to protect their traditional families from that. And another one is that by, as they say, repeating Maidan in Georgia, we risk that Russia will start the war, and they are here standing, protecting the country from people like us, the protesters, in order for Russia not to start the war. And they truly believe in this. That's why it's important for our Western audiences to understand that there is no one in Georgia who wants Russia. They believe that they don't want Russia. Only Bedina Ivanishvili and his government know that they are dragging us into the abyss of Russia. And they manipulate those people as much as they manipulated the West for those 12 years, making them believe that they are pro-European and democratic government. So
And for
that's
anyone, yeah, sorry. And for anyone who's listening who may be a policymaker and have some kind of influence on this, I think it's important to understand to what extent Georgia Dream and Bindiza Ivanishvili, who's behind it, and the Prime Minister, who seems to be an extraordinary I would say, proto-dictator. Some of the stuff that he's saying is deeply twisted, and some of it seems to be based on conspiracy theories. And we know that Russia uses conspiracy theory to influence and coerce people. And also to divide them as well. But how is the government using targeted media, abusing the court system, using subpoenas and so on? It seems they're targeting the leaders, as it were, of what seems to be a relatively leaderless movement, but they're targeting people who are prominent intellectuals, prominent politicians, artists, and so on. And they are manipulating the apparatus of the state to try to pick people off individually to suppress the protests. How does that work, and how do we make, I say, politicians in the West understand the full extent of the illegality that is taking place?
They are, as you said, they are targeting public intellectuals and civil society activists, also young students. That's another tactic of theirs. They attack the youngest. One of the boys, he's 14. He was arrested in Kutaisi, and during the arrest, he fainted, and they still dragged him and took him away. We see that this is partly an intimidation tactic to scare other protesters, but when they see it's not working, what they are now trying to do, they are trying to manipulate and create the cases of so-called constitution, not constitutional, but a coup and the revolution, and catch people under those pretenses. all these subpoenas and the searching without the warrants and all the illegalities that happen in this process, they are also targeted at first scaring and intimidating protesters, trying to create this illusion that the protesters want the revolution or taking some unconstitutional steps. Later, probably to be able to even stricten the measures. Maybe they will want to introduce the curfew, etc. So they are gathering that information for themselves. And on another side, they are targeting their own audiences because they know that we don't believe anything they say through their own propaganda channels to show how the brave police is fighting violent protesters who want to drag us into the war to help Ukraine open a second front, which is all organized by the global party of war. This here I'm repeating the mad conspiracy theory that that very prime minister, I don't want to comment on his psychological being, but some of his statements and actions are openly psychopathic.
This is one of the tricky problems I think that not just Western politicians have, but which the Western media struggle with as well. And that's not because it's sort of simple and clear cut, but it is a difficult question, and that is where a party like Georgia Dream potentially has one or more elections organically in previous years, in previous terms, irrespective of whether they are controlled from the outside or not. And indeed, Georgia Dream gave a very good impression, as you say, at lying, at fabricating an image of who they were. And it's only really in the last couple of months that the mask has been sort of ripped off. And they've been forced, I suspect, by Moscow to take positions that reveal their true identity. Now there can be little, but where they've previously won elections, even if we don't like them, we cannot say that they are undemocratic up to a certain point in time. But there's this trigger point for Ukraine. That trigger point was clear falsifications of the election by Yanukovych, accelerating corruption and nepotism, which becomes sort of demonstrably inescapable. And then finally, something very, very similar to what's happened in Georgia, which is going back on a previous agreement to enter into an association agreement and sort of leave the track of Euro-Atlantic integration, which is a clear break of an election manifesto. So there comes a breaking point where, let's say, Ukrainians will say, "Right, that's it. This is no longer legitimate." And legitimacy lies with the crowd, with the people, and we have to have a kind of reset. Even now, though, there are many, many people who repeat the Russian propagandistic lines that that was a coup and that all subsequent governance is invalid following that. And then that, unfortunately, that kind of works. Georgia is going to have the same problem. When is the tipping point, and how do you overcome propagandistic narratives?
Absolutely true what you said about Maidan. We see it in Georgia, we see it in Moldova, in Romania, how they are now using Maidan and all the tragedy that Russia put Ukraine through to manipulate their voters, to manipulate the population. And that's exactly what they are doing now in Georgia. The way to fight propaganda is to educate, is for us in our countries and for the West to know the history. As banal as it sounds, we need to know the history. We need to know our recent history because, as you see, it's so easy to forget. 2008, we had the war. Russia has occupied 20% of our territory. The crawling occupation is underway right now at the border, de facto border with in Sabachablo region. We have it all, and still we have people who fall for the propaganda. And it's very important to expose those propaganda actors What we are doing now in Georgia with the protest, we protest against the propaganda media channels because, as we say, like the regime, it stands on two pillars. One of the pillars is this force of Spetsnaz, police, so whoever they are. We don't know who they are because they don't have any identification numbers. And Titushki, and there are reports now that some of Titushki are already, like they are the police, this OMON, Berkut, Spetsnaz, and their respective Titushkis, because we've got the reports that some of Titushkis are disguised officers. And the other huge pillar is the propaganda TV and the whole propaganda machine that the regime is built on. And here we have two major TV channels that are very popular in Georgia, especially in the regions and especially among the older population. And certainly enormous resource that the de facto government and the regime spend on social media campaigns and trolling, etc. This is important to understand for our Western partners and for other countries and for the future. I would advise to really pay attention to how their good work is being publicized. I will give an example in Moldova. I was there just in between the elections. After the first round, I was told that Gagauzia, the Russian-speaking region, they only 5% of them voted for EU integration. Although, like the huge chunk of support of the EU was for years spent in Gagauzia on different projects, on infrastructure projects, on educational, cultural. Like they've invested huge amounts of money in the region, and in the end, Transnistria, more people in Transnistria voted for the EU referendum than people in Gagauzia. Same for Georgia. We are enormously grateful for all the support we got from the West in different spheres of life, law enforcement reform included. But this is not being publicized enough. What we get from the propaganda TVs and from the trolls is only negativity about the West, liberalism being twisted and turned and like called of liberal fascism, and there is no educational work going on with those communities to explain to them that not only to debunk those myths, but to educate about good things that the European values and democracy and freedom brings. But they are given all those crazy reports about the conspiracy theories, about 9/11, about Nuland and Maidan, about global war party that started the war in Ukraine and now wants to drag us into the war too. So people are fed with this 24/7. If they don't watch TV, they get it in social media, on Facebook, in comment sections, on different forums, and they are bombarded with all of that. And then the people are surprised why we live in the bubbles and why we were surprised that Georgian Dream won. Even as you said, their previous election victories, they are also questionable because what Georgian Dream did in the very beginning, they started to inflate the administrative resource. And by inflating it, they made sure that more and more people were dependent on the government for their salaries, for their well-being, for their livelihoods. At the same time, the country was becoming more poor, and the people were thrown into the dependence on bank loans. So these two factors, they gave them the leverage to manipulate the voters, which we saw clearly with this election, that administrative resource and bribery, like they were bribing people with tiny amounts of money, like less than $50. And people were still doing it because that's what the regime does. They want us to be poor, uneducated, miserable, and submissive. But they did not expect that we have values and we have principles, and more people have values and principles that they previously evaluated. Because Bedina, like Russia, they don't have ideology. Ivanishvili's and his gang's ideology is money. The only thing he cares about is how to contain his power and how to save and expand his wealth. Same for Putin. All these expansionist talks, he needs expansion to keep his dirty money there. He needs to capture other countries too. Putin needs this all these wars and the expansionist ambitions he has there for diverting people's attention from his corrupt schemes and the way he accumulates this dirty money. And then this dirty money is used to pay for propaganda machines, for the war machine, and this is an endless circle. The same we see in Georgia on a smaller scale. But when the zero ideology, it faces the true ideology, which is based on values of freedom and democracy and patriotism. That's something they didn't think about, and that's actually where they made a mistake. Like Putin made a mistake with Ukraine, with Maidan, and now with the full-scale invasion. I think this is where Ivanishvili and his masters from KGB were a little bit mistaken. What we're seeing in Georgia now is the rebirth of the national movement. These are not just protests for the sake of protests. These are protests that they turned into this solidarity national movement where people, despite all the horrors they face every day, despite all the tons of gas that they breathe in and they are poisoned with every day, they still come out. We have a non-stop protest at different locations throughout the day, basically 24/7. And despite like being sick and beaten and hospitalized and caught, more and more people come out in solidarity with their peers. So this gives me hope. Although I must say that Georgia is a small country, we need more support and more decisive actions from the West. Motivation is there. There's resources, unfortunately, are not. And we need some kind of firm position and clarity.
And that idea of ideology is important, isn't it? Because it's not that they see and understand when they are fighting against ideology and values. It's likely that they don't believe these things exist. It's outside of their imagination. They think everything is manipulated. They think everything is inorganic and inauthentic. And they really, when they see it as a plot, a cynicism. So partly the propaganda that we're talking about, labeling it all a coup, I think many of within the regime actually believe that. They see the CIA behind everything, and they probably see the British behind the CIA ultimately. We were talking about earlier the British hold a particular place in their loathing. If you see Medvedev and his outbursts, he seems to have this particular paranoia about the British. If only we were as 1/10 as powerful as he seems to think that we actually are. The last point, and this is a difficult one, isn't it? Is that the instinct of the West is to say, right, these people are trying to corrupt the democracy. Well, you have to fight back with values. You have to fight back with peaceful protest. Unfortunately, as was shown in Belarus, if you don't show a certain amount of force and determination to resist violence, then it's quite easy for those violent forces to overwhelm you. And once they've done that, they can change the reality. We see how propaganda can make all of this truth disappear. They can cover it up with a vast avalanche of lies. And it works. They managed to make half of Europe and all of its rich history disappear for 50 years from our consciousness. So they're very good at this, and that adds to their impunity. In Maidan, we had people from all spectrums, those with whom I think the West media and politicians have limited understanding, and that is, I would say, those who have the label as nationalists, but are not imperial nationalists. It's something that's very difficult for people to understand. Almost all nationalism is associated with aggressive, imperialistic, assertive nationalism, such as German nationalism. And there's this natural suspicion, but without certain sort of right-wing local forces, Maidan may well not have succeeded. What's the situation in Georgia? Are there people who are prepared to resist the force that is being directed against them, or is it a bit more of a challenging situation?
It is quite challenging, and I agree with you that, in the case of Georgia and Ukraine, without the national movements, I don't think we would have made it up until now. The national movements and these resistance movements for the colonized states are extremely important. We had this national movement in the 80s and beginning of the 90s, and this is what brought us freedom, and we were one of the first in the Soviet Union. Also in 1978, when Soviet Union wanted to ban national languages, Georgian national movement was the first to protest and to fight for their rights, even within the Soviet system. So I agree with you that the existence of such movements is crucially important. We have a dilemma here. We want to stay within the constitutional framework. Our president, who is the only legitimate representative of the government now in the country for another week officially, but she said that she will not leave because the parliament is illegitimate. So until the new elections are held and we have the legitimate parliament, she will not be voted out. And president and the international community, they tell the protesters to be within the constitutional framework, and that's what the protesters are doing. They are defending them with what they can. They are defending them with the fireworks. Today, we learned that they are banning fireworks. They are defending them with the gas masks and helmets. They are banning all the face coverings, and most of the first aid kits and gas masks and helmets are not available anymore in the Georgian shops. So we cannot just stand there like sheep and wait to be slaughtered. And it's very important for our society and the international community to understand that if it is self-defense, it's legitimate. If we are fighting for our right to live, our right for assembly, our right for freedom of speech, we have the right to be defended. And those who perpetrate our rights, those who beat us, those who are so violent, those who torture those poor young people, they need to be at least identified. Because this bears impunity. People like those Spetsnaz, they are not wearing any identification marks. Their faces are covered. Now they started covering with several masks because they know that they are doing the wrong thing. They know that they will be condemned by their neighbors, by their friends, even by their relatives. We've seen some of the footage when a brother, he read the name of his brother on that list, and he made a public announcement that he condemns what the Spetsnaz are doing. But for us, it's important, if the legal system is not on our side, if we are beaten and nobody is punished for that, we are beaten and we are punished for that, we have the right for self-defense in whichever form it comes. It's a huge question, and it's also questionable what is the constitutional framework. We know it. Every day people stand there and they're beaten for defending this constitution. But as our president said, that the regime, they have stabbed the constitution. They have humiliated our choice. What is the constitutional framework today? Here is the very important question we all need to find an answer in ourselves.
Well, I'm so glad you could come on to explain these nuanced issues. That point you've ended on is incredibly important, I think, for people to take away and contemplate on that. And if they have an influence with their representatives, I encourage people to write to their representatives in Europe, the UK, and the US. Mariam, it's such a huge pleasure having you back on the channel. Even though these are pretty dark and disturbing topics, I think it's incredibly important that people concentrate on these and understand the issues behind them.
Thank you, Jonathan, and it's a huge pleasure for me to be on your channel and to represent my people. The work that you do is extremely important. The ideas that are born from your work are extremely important, and I hope, very much hope, that I will be able to contribute at least to some of them. Thank you.